Your savings account is involved in a financial pattern that has ended empires, collapsed currencies, and wiped out the life savings of ordinary people. Not once in history, but 9 times in living memory, with the same sequence, the same warning signs, and the same political excuses every single time. And right now, the International Monetary Fund is monitoring 7 countries where that exact sequence is actively running. 3 of those countries are not in the developing world. One is a G20 superpower. And one of them, the one senior economists will not name on camera, is almost certainly the country that printed the money sitting in your bank account right now. We track this data daily, and what we found this week should concern every single person watching this. Before you watch another minute of financial news, you need to understand one thing. The media is not lying to you. They are doing something quieter and more dangerous. They are looking in the wrong direction entirely. If you have ever wondered why financial crises always seem to blindside the public while insiders exit quietly months in advance, stay with this, because that answer is in this video. And because the evidence we are about to show you is precise, sourced, and structured around 3 numbers that function as the earliest warning system ever built for sovereign collapse. Those 3 numbers are 90, 3, and 0. 90%, the debt-to-GDP ratio, at which renowned economist Kenneth Rogoff, after analyzing 66 countries across 8 centuries of data, found that the probability of a forced debt restructuring increases by 400%. Not doubles, quadruples. 3 months, the minimum foreign exchange reserve coverage that separates a country in financial stress from a country in financial freefall. When reserves drop below 3 months of import coverage, the IMF formally classifies that nation as being in reserve distress. The government can no longer defend its currency. It cannot guarantee it can pay its import bills. And it begins making the choice no Treasury minister ever announces publicly, whether to service debt or import food. And 0. The moment political leadership abandons monetary discipline and begins printing money to resolve a debt problem. Economist Ray Dalio, after 40 years studying this across hundreds of economies, calls this the irreversible signal. In every documented case, Argentina 2001, Venezuela across the entire 2010s, Turkey 2021, Sri Lanka 2022, the decision to print happened first. Everything else followed. When all 3 signals appear simultaneously, Rogoff calls it the triple coincidence. In 30 years of research, every nation that hit the triple coincidence experienced a formal default, a debt restructuring, or a currency collapse within 18 months, without a single exception. Now the countdown, and if you are not yet subscribed, do it now, because the country that lands at number 1 on this list will genuinely change how you think about where your money is safest. We track this daily, not weekly, and the numbers are moving faster than the headlines suggest. Country number 7 is Bangladesh. A genuine development success story. 25 million people lifted from poverty between 2000 and 2020. GDP growing at 6 to 7% annually. A garment export industry supplying virtually every Western fashion brand you recognize. Then 3 shocks arrived simultaneously. The pandemic cut export revenue by 17% in a single year. The 2022 global energy crisis doubled the fuel import bill from $6 billion to over $12 billion in 12 months. And the Federal Reserve's most aggressive rate hiking cycle in 4 decades strengthened the dollar and raised the real cost of every dollar-denominated debt payment Bangladesh owed. The result? Foreign exchange reserves collapsed from $46 billion to under $21 billion in 18 months. A 55% depletion of the National Emergency Fund in a year and a half. Factories supplying H&M, Zara, and Gap began shutting down for 10 to 12 hours daily because the government could no longer afford the fuel to keep the national grid running. Bangladesh sits at 7 because its debt-to-GDP ratio of 39% remains well below the 90% threshold. But direction of travel is everything in Dalio's framework. A country with low debt and rapidly depleting reserves is more dangerous than one with high debt and stable reserves, because the low-debt country can still borrow, and will, until the moment it cannot. Country number 6 is Egypt. And the fact that Egypt receives almost no attention in Western financial media is not a sign that it is safe. It is a sign that the financial media is, again, looking in the wrong direction. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. It imports 80% of its wheat from international markets, making it uniquely exposed to any commodity price shock anywhere in the world. It has 107 million people, the largest population in the Arab world, growing at 2% per year, demanding food, energy, and employment that the state is structurally unable to provide at current fiscal capacity. Egypt's debt-to-GDP ratio reached 95% in 2024, above Rogoff's threshold. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Egypt's primary wheat supplier, it simultaneously cut off supply and drove global wheat prices up by 60%. Egypt was forced to spend dollars it did not have to import food it could not grow. The Egyptian pound has since lost 60% of its value against the dollar. The IMF has intervened 3 times since 2016 and extended over $20 billion in emergency financing. Each loan came with conditions: subsidy cuts, currency devaluations, fiscal tightening. Each round of austerity created intense political pressure in a country where food already consumes 40 to 50% of household income for the poorest half of the population. Bread subsidies that have existed since the 1950s as a social contract between the government and its people are now consuming a budget that cannot mathematically sustain them. The choice between honoring international creditors and feeding the population is no longer theoretical. It is the live budget decision being made right now. Country number 5 is Pakistan, and this is where the triple coincidence becomes visible. Debt to GDP is 87%, approaching the threshold with no credible reduction plan. Foreign exchange reserves in January 2023 fell to $3.7 billion. That is less than 3 weeks of import coverage. Not 3 months, 3 weeks. Pakistan was within days, not weeks, days, of a formal sovereign default when the IMF intervened with a $3 billion emergency facility that provided just enough liquidity to prevent immediate collapse. Pakistan has visited the IMF 23 times since 1958. That number is not a coincidence. It is a precise description of a structural problem that IMF interventions delay but do not resolve. They provide breathing room in exchange for conditions, subsidy reductions, monetary tightening, fiscal discipline that are politically painful to implement and are frequently reversed by the next government that wins an election by promising to reverse them. The cycle repeats. The debt compounds. The vulnerabilities persist. Interest payments now consume over 50% of total federal revenue. Every rupee servicing existing debt is a rupee that cannot fund the energy infrastructure investment that would reduce import dependency. The trap does not loosen. It tightens with every payment cycle. Country number 4 is Turkey. And Turkey is the case study that should disturb every investor who believes that monetary credibility, once established, is difficult to destroy. Because Turkey proved the opposite. Between 2021 and 2023, in a G20 economy, a NATO member, a country with sophisticated financial institutions, and a functioning central bank, inflation reached 85%, the highest of any G20 economy since Argentina's crisis of the early 2000s. The Turkish lira lost 80% of its value against the dollar in 3 years. The cause was not external shock. It was not a war, a pandemic, or a commodity spike. It was a deliberate policy decision by President Erdogan, who held the conviction that high interest rates cause inflation rather than reduce it. Every credentialed economist disagreed. Every central bank model disagreed. The market disagreed by selling the lira consistently and aggressively. Erdogan continued cutting rates as inflation rose for 20 consecutive months. A new central bank governor appointed in 2023 raised rates aggressively to 40%, and inflation has since declined from 85 to approximately 30%. Still catastrophic, but declining. Turkey belongs on this countdown not because of its current trajectory, but because of what it proved. That in a modern economy with every institutional safeguard in place, monetary credibility can be destroyed in under 2 years. And 2 years of correct policy later, inflation still sits at 30%. Trust, once broken, does not return on schedule. Country number 3 is Argentina, a nation that has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 times, more than any other country in the modern era. The 2001 default remains the most instructive in modern financial history. Argentina had maintained a fixed exchange rate, 1 peso to $1, since 1991. For a decade, it worked. It controlled inflation, attracted foreign investment, and stabilized an economy ravaged by hyperinflation in the 1980s. But a fixed exchange rate demands permanent fiscal discipline. Argentina ran persistent deficits. The IMF extended loans conditioned on austerity. The austerity triggered social unrest. The unrest produced political paralysis. The paralysis prevented the reforms the IMF required to extend the next loan. And in December 2001, Argentina defaulted on $93 billion of sovereign debt, the largest sovereign default in recorded history at that moment. What followed is the template for what collapse actually looks like for ordinary people. Savings accounts frozen, then converted from dollars into pesos at an official rate of 1.4 to 1. Within months, the black market rate was 3.5 to 1. Anyone who had saved in dollars held in an Argentine bank lost 70% of the real value of those savings, not in a market crash they could have anticipated, in a government decree issued on a weekend. Today, Argentina's radical new fiscal experiment under President Milei has produced the first primary fiscal surplus in over a decade. Inflation is still above 100% annually. The historical record of recoveries from Argentine defaults suggests the timeline is measured in decades, not years. Country number 2 is Japan. And this is where the script breaks every assumption you have been building about what dangerous debt looks like. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is 263%. That is not a misprint. 263% of annual economic output, the highest sovereign debt ratio of any developed economy in recorded history by a significant margin. By Rogoff's framework, Japan should have faced a debt crisis 2 decades ago. It has not. And understanding why it has not is the single most important insight in modern sovereign debt economics. Over 90% of Japanese government bonds are held by Japanese institutions: the Bank of Japan, pension funds, insurance companies, regional banks. There is no external creditor demanding repayment in a foreign currency. There is no foreign exchange crisis from a creditor sell-off. The loop is closed. The Japanese government owes money to the Japanese people, and the Japanese people, through their institutions, continue to accept near zero interest rates because pulling out would be self-destructive. But in 2022, that loop showed its first serious fracture. Global inflation arrived in Japan for the first time in 30 years. The Bank of Japan faced a fundamental contradiction: raise rates to fight inflation and risk collapsing the domestic bond market under the weight of 263% of GDP in debt, or maintain near zero rates and allow inflation to slowly erode the real value of those bonds, a slow-motion default by another name. When the Bank of Japan made even marginal adjustments to its yield curve control policy, the yen fell to its lowest level against the dollar in 32 years. If Japanese interest rates were to normalize to even 2%, a rate that would be considered emergency low in any other developed economy. Japan's annual debt servicing cost would exceed its entire annual tax revenue. The government would be mathematically incapable of paying its interest without printing money. Japan has not collapsed, but Japan is the slow-motion demonstration of what happens when a reckoning is postponed so consistently for so long that the reckoning itself becomes existential. And that brings us to number one, the country every economist in this analysis knows belongs at the top, and the one most are reluctant to name out loud in a professional setting. That reluctance is itself a data point worth examining. In fiscal year 2024, the United States government spent more on interest payments on its national debt than it spent on national defense. Interest payments totaled $1.1 trillion. The defense budget was $886 billion. Interest exceeded defense. Ray Dalio identifies this specific threshold, interest consuming more than the defense budget, as stage 5 in his empire cycle analysis, the stage where the financial system becomes mathematically constrained rather than merely stressed. U.S. debt to GDP stands at 124%, well above Rogoff's 90% threshold. The Congressional Budget Office, using conservative growth and interest rate assumptions, projects U.S. debt reaching 200% of GDP by 2047 if current trajectories hold. That is the Japanese trajectory, the same mathematical sequence running on a longer timeline toward the same endpoint. The crucial difference is the dollar's reserve currency status. Because every nation on Earth holds dollars in its central bank reserves, in its international trade contracts, in its sovereign wealth funds, there is a structural global demand for dollars and for U.S. Treasury bonds that no other country on this list can replicate. That demand is what has kept the United States from appearing in the financial media's crisis headlines. But the numbers that precede those headlines are already in the data, and we are watching them move every single day. If this analysis changed how you think about where your money is safest, share this video with someone who needs to see these numbers. Drop it in the comments. Do you believe the US dollar loses its reserve currency status within your lifetime? Because the answer to that question determines everything about what comes next. And we will be tracking it with you daily, right here. If you want to understand the financial forces shaping your future before the headlines catch up, subscribe now. We do not wait for the story to break. We track the data while it is still forming.